Hi, and welcome back to the FastAPI and Okteto series. In this video, we'll be setting up our application structure as well as creating the initial deployment to Okteto and setting up our domain environments. Cool. So, for the guestbook API, we're going to have some basic routes like user login and registration, creating of entries, reading entries, and deleting entries. For this application, we will not be implementing the update entries. And before we go deep into these details, let us define our application structure by adding some files and folders. Application looks scanty. We don't literally have anything here at the moment. So the first step is to create some files and folders. And so the first file we're going to create is going to be the requirements.txt file. This is responsible for holding our packages that are going to install. We're going to create an entry points file, .py. Oops, sorry, that would mean .py. We're going to make an app, a directory app. So in our application, in this app directory, we're going to store the route files, the database files, and any utility or helper files you're going to have in the course of building this application. And now that we have all of this, how do we then deploy our application? We need to build our application's image. We need a manifest so that when we send this application to Okteto can build our, application with respect to the manifest we send. And for that, we're going to use Docker Compose manifest, and we're going to need a Docker file for building our image. So we're going to say Docker file and Docker compose.yum file. And there we go. And now, in our Docker file, we are going to give the instructions for application. We're going to say from Python, sorry, 3.9. We're going to use the latest, right? And we're going to set the work directory to this. Why we are setting the work directory to this is so when we create our development environment, Okteto knows what folder to synchronize our, local files with. What I mean by that is when you start the development environment, the work directory listed in your Docker file is going to be used, and the changes you make in your local environments, which is my PyCharm here now, will synchronize into the app folder, thereby making it easier for us to, observe and notice the changes we make in application. In a nutshell, the work directory, this is not needed. So I'm going to cut this part out. Next, we add requirements. Also, requirements txt, and we add main.py, which is our entry file. And the next thing is we're going to install, since we have all of this requirements .txt, and we want to add up everything here, and we are going to expose the port 8080. That is, we're going to use the 8080 port here, and so the command for this is going to be Python main.py. So quick recap of our Docker file, we have, we're using Python 3.9, we set our work directory to the app, we copied our requirements file, our entry file, which is main.py, we installed the requirements, and then we've moved our app folder, which contains the routes files, database files, and other utility files we might need. And then we are exposing the port 8080, that is when this application is started, the port 8080 should be exposed. Normally, Okteto's development environment listens to port 8080, which is one of the reasons why my favorite port is port 8080. And then lastly, the command to start application. Now, for next step is to fill our requirements file. We're going to use the FastAPI. We're going to use UVCon. So those are the requirements for now. And in our entry file, how do you start your application if you have this? So we're going to import UVCon here, and we're going to say, okay, do this. And we have UVCon.run, We leave this blank for now. In our app folder, it's currently empty. And like I said earlier, we need a route file and some other files. So for now, we're going to just create an API.py file. This is going to be responsible for our routing. Oh, this should be moved into the app folder. Yes, refactor. Add. Oh, I'll just this is not necessarily needed. Okay. So in our API, the API file is empty. And so we're just going to create an instance of FastAPI. We have from FastAPI imports FastAPI. I'm going to have let's say router should be equals to FastAPI. Yeah. And for now we just define a very basic route. We're going to say router.get this. We're going to say define. Well, we can just use the normal one. So just to define welcome and return this message. Oh, to the FastAPI and Okteto series. Right. So now in UVCon, we are going to run app.api. So the FastAPI instance, we're going to have the host as 0.0.0.0, and the ports should be port 8080. And we want to automatically reload our changes. As when we make changes here, we want our FastAPI application to automatically rebuild and reload so we can see these changes. And now that we have this set, that is, we have our entry file is ready. We have Docker file, and the next thing is to list the services in our Docker Compose manifest. So we start by giving the version here, and then we list the services. We're going to say the first service should be web, right? And we're going to say build, and just use Docker file that we have locally. And all ports are we exposing? We have port 8080. Yes, so we have these ports that we want to expose. A quick recap of what I've done so far is create the entry file, the requirements.txt file, a Docker file and a Docker Compose manifest, and then a route file in app folder. With this done and completed, the next step is to create an initial deployment to Okteto. By creating an initial deployment, it enables us to create a development environment. But first, we need access into the Okteto cluster. And so, click on login. If you don't have an account, you use the GitHub sign-on, and you'll be granted 5 free namespaces. It comes at no cost. You do not have to use your credit card. Okay. And now you can see we have an empty namespace. And how do you then deploy application? You can deploy application from Stack or Compose from GitHub, or whatever way you want to. But since we're going to install this locally, the first step is installing the Okteto CLI. I currently have, but to install, you run on Mac, we install Okteto. For Windows and Linux users, the guide on how to install is in the description of this video. Okay, so we are updating our Okteto CLI. And now, once the Okteto CLI is installed completely, you then need to log in from the CLI. By logging in, it means you are giving the Okteto CLI access to your cluster. So the next step is to run Okteto login. And it asks for the instance, so we're using this cloud, and then you click on this link here. You can just copy this and move back here and paste this here. And now it says you are now logged in and your session is now active in the Okteto CLI. What this means is that now whatever changes or command I run from Okteto CLI, it is going to, do the same here in my cluster. And now it says run Okteto namespace to switch your context, meaning I have this namespace, youngest dev. So when I run Okteto namespace youngest dev. It means all the commands I run from Okteto should, be reflected in the youngest dev namespace. So what's the next step? I have the initial application, so next step is to deploy it. So I'm going to use Okteto stack deploy double tag build. So we have a new image for our application. And when you run this command, Okteto first builds the image for your application. From Docker Compose, we already told it, okay, build the web service. So from the web service, it builds it first. And after building, our services is then deployed to Okteto. As you can see from the logs here, the building is almost complete. Once the image is built, then the service is going to be deployed. Okay. Cool. And so the image for our service web has been successfully pushed. And now we are now deploying the stack guestbook API. When you go back to your Okteto dashboard, you can see that the guestbook API stack is currently being deployed. Once this has been deployed here on the command line, it means also it has been deployed. And you can see that we have one deployment web. When you click on this, you can see the logs. Our application is booting, and you can see the complete logs of your application. It says application startup complete, and you are just waiting now for an endpoint. So once the application has been deployed and has completed the booting stage and is now running, a public HTTPS endpoint is generated for you to view your application. As you can see, the endpoint is shown here. Oh, this is the endpoint for our application we just deployed, web youngest dev or cloud Octo. When I click on this and it says welcome to the FastAPI Octo series, means the application has worked. But then we don't always want to have to build our image every time to see this. And because this is a production deployment, how then do we make changes and do we build this? Now it's time to activate our development environments. The first step in activating your development environment is creating an Okteto manifest. The manifest is a set of instructions that tells Okteto to create a development container with respect to what has been configured. To create an Okteto manifest, okteto init command is invoked. So you do okteto init. When you run this, it looks through the list of current deployment that you have, and you select the deployments in which you want to create a development environment for. In this scenario, we are going to create an environment for the web deployment. We click on web. It analyzes this deployment to know the tools to provide. We are running a Python application, so obviously pip is needed, Python env is needed. The Python shell itself is also needed. And now our manifest has been created, and the next step is to run okteto up to activate our deployment, our development container. And run okteto up. And while our container is being set up, let us go through briefly the contents. Now, in our okteto.yml file, our manifest, we have the name of the deployment, the command, that is, all the commands we've been running in our terminal can also be run in our development environment container. We have the volumes, we have the synchronization here, and it tells us that we are synchronizing this folder where it is invoked in to the work directory that we defined earlier. And what ports are we forwarding? Port 8080 and the reverse ports. These ports here is what Okteto listens to. So your application is started on port 8080, the development container is live. You can see that from the logs here that our application's persistence volume for development container is being created. Likewise, when you go back to your dashboard, you can see the change in the states of your application, which is now progressing. And introduction of a new development volume, Okteto Web, which is now in use. You can also monitor from your logs and see the difference where your application is being run in production and in development. Back. And the persistent volume has successfully attached, which you confirmed here, and we are pulling images and waiting for the final process to be done, and then we will be welcomed into our development environment, after which we will then build some routes. While we wait for development environment to finish setting up, in our routes file, we are going to define, how do we want the inputs from our API request how do you want it to look like? So for when you want to create a user, when you want to log in, when you want to create an entry, how should it work? And so we're going to make use of Pydantic. So from Pydantic, imports or imports, let's leave this out for now. Okay, cool. So now our development environment has been built. And when you list here, you can see all the files that we have. Now, when your application is in development mode, you are in control. Your application is not automatically started. So your application needs to be started on port 8080 for it to work. What I mean is this. Now the status has changed to in development. And when I click on the link generated earlier, it says start your service on port 8080 from your Okteto terminal. Interesting. So now I'm just going to run the command python main.py. And when I go back here and refresh, I have welcome to the FastAPI plus Okteto series. Cool. How then do I know it's working? So to notice the change and see the automatic synchronization, I'm going to say welcome FastAPI in development mode. And when I save this and I go back and I reload, I have a new message in development mode. Cool. So then we can proceed to building our route. Define the routes for our entries. We're going to call these entries, and we're going to say fine retrieve entries, right? And we're going to return these entries and entries and going to entries. As a result, we're going to use a local in-app database for now. And in the next video, we're going to configure a MongoDB database. So we'll have entries here, which is going to be an array. And we want to add a route to host an entry. So we have add entry. We have this data, which is going to be a dictionary. And we're just going to say entries.append data. And then we return a message that says entry added successfully. We want to, now for now we have these two routes. Why don't we test them out? Thanks to FastAPI, we have an interactive documentation here. We're going to make use of this documentation. So the first thing is we're going to post an entry, and we're going to say, for now, we're just going to say the user is youngest dev, and the item I have in my entry should be hello. This is the first entry in Okteto's guest book. And then I execute this, and I have entry added successfully. And now I can test this out, and I can see the entry I have, which means these routes work perfectly. And as you can see, I did not have any reason to rebuild this image and redeploy to production. So I'm sure that when I push this to production, this is going to work perfectly. Okay, so now that I have this in check, of course, we want to also be able to delete entries. So we have, for that purpose, we're going to have to modify our entries to have IDs. So we have router.delete entry ID. I'm going to delete our entry, right? And we have this ID to be an integer. So let's say we have an ID for now. And we are going to have to check. So we have we say entries dot pop. Let's say the index ID here. And I'm going to return message is entry deleted successfully. To keep track of the IDs, we are going to say entry added successfully with ID. We have to formats with ID. Formats, we're going to say length of the entries. Okay. So now that we save this, we'll go back to our interactive documentation and then we reload. And now we have a post and a delete. And so we're going to try this out again to see does it work. So we're going to have the same thing here. Let's say we have user as the youngest div, and I have item as hello guest bookers. Okay, and I execute this, and now it tells me that the entry has been added successfully with ID 1. Okay, I feel like deleting this entry, and so I'm going to say 1. But we know the indexing in Python works differently, so I'm going to instead put 0 here. And we have an internal server error. So now, if this was if this was in production, how would you have tackled this? Because you already built your application and you pushed it, and this was working locally. But now we have this error, means we can debug, and says string cannot be interpreted as an integer. So what do? We set this to int, and you save. The application is back up and running. Then you go back and you try it once again, and you have an internal server error. So you cannot pull from an empty list because we are using an in-app database, and so whenever we make changes, we need to re-add. And so we are going to add this once again, and then try our delete. And said entry deleted successfully. How do we confirm? Again, by going back to the get entries and checking it out. Cool, so this works. So we're going to move on. We don't want to always have to put, the names of the user manually. We want to make this easier, so we're going to just create another basic database and say users should also be this, an array. And so we have post. It's going to be user new. Let me say register user. It's going to be dictionary. We're just going to, without checking, we're just going to say users.append data and say return this message and say user registration successful. Right. Likewise, the basic check that's post again user, but this time around we're going to say this is login user, and you have data to be in form of dictionary once again. You have if user, sorry, we're going to have to change to user. If user in users, then I'm going to return a message that says this user is logged in successfully. logged in successfully. And then otherwise we return and say message invalid details, and we save. So when we go back to interactive documentation, we can see that these changes have been applied and we have new routes. We have the post user and login user. So we can just create a basic user and say maybe username should be youngest dev, and maybe the password should be I love Okteto, right? And so I execute this and it says user registration successful. And I'm going to just copy this to test if our login works. If it works, then we're good to go. I'm going to try this. And I'm going to do this and say we're logged in successful. How about when we have an erroneous detail? What does it say? Invalid details. So I'm going to do a quick recap of what we've done so far. This is a basic demonstration of how Okteto environments work. In this video, we set up our application, the folder, we created the initial deployment, we created basic routes on adding entry, deleting entry. In the next video, we are going to add the models on how we want our application to behave. How do we want the entries to look like instead of having to manually fill in the dictionaries? How can we do this? How can we specify and validate our inputs? How can we also, improve our existing application, all again in the Okteto development environment? So the summary of this video is the first thing we did was to bulk up our application by creating necessary files and folder, and then configured the Docker file and Docker Compose manifest, created an initial deployment to Okteto, and after we have created an initial deployment to Okteto, we checked that it was working from the public HTTPS endpoint. And when we are satisfied with the results, we created an Okteto dev environment. First, by creating a manifest and examining the content of the manifest, and then activating the development container. From the development container, we've been able to debug and work directly to see changes and we're satisfied with these changes. And so we'll be pushing these changes again to the production. To do this, we're going to exit the development container and then deactivate by running Okteto down. So when you go back to your Okteto cluster here, you can see changing from progressing, and this has now changed to unused. And now application is back and running. So you can check your application here. And you can see now we have welcome to the FastAPI and Okteto series, meaning we don't have any updated change for our development. To make changes to our application to reflect in production, we run Okteto stack deploy build. This takes all the changes we've made so far, compile and builds a new image and pushes it to Okteto. And so wait for this here to finish. And once the image has been rebuilt, our image for this service again will be pushed to Okteto and our service will then be redeployed. And then we now check that indeed the application works perfectly as we have seen in the development environment. So the stack is being deployed, and when we move back to Okteto cluster here, you can see this change to deploying stack, which has been deployed now, and application is now being reloaded to reflect the changes that have been pushed now. Okay, so application style complete. Okay, so go back and reload. Okay, this is starting, so it will be available in a few seconds. We go back to our logs to confirm when it's ready. We wait. Okay, and let's run it. Oh, cool, application is now running. So we can now click on our endpoint once again. And now we can see the changes we saw in development mode live in production without any issues or errors, which means the application works perfectly as we have seen. Now, let's go on further to confirm that it works. go to our interactive documentation, and we have all the routes, and everything work just as before. So in this video, once again, we bulked up our application by adding necessary file and folder. Then we created an initial deployment to Okteto cluster here, web, after which we checked we're satisfied. Then we created a development volume, development container here. And then we made all of these changes in our development container without having to run anything locally. And once we were satisfied with the changes, we pushed these changes back to production here, which was now redeployed. And then you can see the last updated time here as a minute ago. And this deployment was originally created 20 minutes ago. In the next video, we'll be working again with our application by cleaning the routes and adding models so our routes can be more standard and we can validate inputs. If you did enjoy this video, do like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.